The Justified Beliefs podcast is meant to be educational, informative, and engaging. Many different opposing religious views and various controversial topics will be discussed on this podcast. This podcast is not meant to belittle or offend anyone or their beliefs. This podcast is meant for a mature audience. If views expressed on this podcast and opinions expressed on this podcast upset you or send you in a downward spiral of anger, I kindly suggest you stop listening. Hello and welcome back to the Justified Belief podcast. I'm your host, Luca. I'm starting a new segment here for all you listeners and viewers out there. It's going to be a little more apologetics based. For those of you who don't know what apologetics is, it's basically justifying why you believe in something. So in this case, the apologetics is going to be for the Christian point of view and the Christian paradigm. Now, if you don't have the same beliefs as me, I think you'll get a lot out of this. It's just a different perspective on, why Jesus, why the Bible. And if you're somebody who doesn't believe, you're right to ask that question. Me asking that question is inevitably what sent me down this road and brought me to Christ, and I got baptized. It's good to ask these questions and find, good answers. A couple things I think most people will find pretty fascinating in this segment, or in this series, I should say, is when we start looking at things like biblical archaeology, because you often hear a lot of folks at times, and I was myself in my ignorance at a time thinking that there was absolutely zero archaeological evidence to support the Bible, but we'll find out, as we go through this, that's just that's a blatant lie and untrue. And also about Jesus as a historical character and not as just a fictional, literary character. There's some interesting documents from non-Christian sources about the historicity of Christ. So this information is great for anyone, and I really hope it piques your interest ultimately, because the real relationship with God is having it individually between you and God and being in His Word and understanding it. So that brings us to today's kind of kickoff topic. Is God real? Everybody has their different point of view. If you don't agree with mine, completely all right. I hope at the very least, this gives you guys, like I said, a different perspective. And I just want to let you know ahead of time, all these PowerPoints are completely free on my Patreon. There'll be links in the video description below. Feel free to head over there if you like what you hear or see, because there is a visual component to this. But for my podcast listeners out there, you're really not going to miss much on this one. The visuals are pretty simple. But in the preceding episodes, highly recommend you guys hop on the YouTube channel to check out some of the charts and graphs and things of that nature. And again, these discussions for the series are highlights. It's almost, these conversations can go deep and carry on for hours and hours. I try to get the highlights together, things that interest me, conversations that I found pretty interesting. But ultimately, I hope this, kickstarts some folks for the faith and brings them closer to Christ. And these podcasts, or excuse me, these PowerPoints are good too for the believer if you're trying to, minister to your friends and family. I just also am doing this because what is said in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 through 16. It says, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame." So it's always good to explain to people why we hope, right? Why we have hope in Christ, why are we Christians, and that sort of thing. And I hope after this series, it gives folks a lot more confidence in their faith and a reason to believe, other than just saying, well, the Bible is true because God. Because if that's all you've got, it's not very convincing for the layman. So anyway, Let's jump right in. So, as I said, this one is titled, Is God Real? So there are many arguments for the existence of God, from philosophical to scientific. If you're teetering on the fence of faith, I hope the information here helps you and others. So just for right now, for everybody out there, let's kind of forget about religion right now and just focus on the thought of an omnipotent being. We're going to take a look at some of the following arguments for the existence of God. One of my favorites, and I find very interesting and compelling, is morality, what it is, and a moral law. Something called an intelligent designer theory. It gets a lot of flack from some secular folks, but the concept is intriguing to me anyway. Then we're going to talk about the axioms of life, the source of knowledge, feelings, creation, and what the human image is. So I know there's a lot of different religions and different belief systems out there. But for me personally, just so you guys know kind of where I'm coming from, I obviously, because of the podcast and everything, I do believe in God. My whole thing is, if there is a God, God can't contradict himself because he won't be God. So, it stands to reason that not every single religion out there can be divinely inspired, because they pretty much all contradict each other. So then the next logical question is, again, well, why Christianity? Why Jesus, why the Bible? And that's what this whole series is going to be about. The first topic, as I brought up, is morality and a moral lawgiver. So the existence of a moral law would suggest a moral lawgiver, an enforcer of that moral law. If there was not a final authority beyond humanity that gives us a moral law, morality would be at the mercy of the majority rule. Morality would be defined by society at large and can change depending on the culture of the time, rather than being a firm foundational moral law that never changes, which is what God provides us. So just an example of this, because we can see this in our day and age now, morality and what's right and wrong, of just being at the mercy of mob rule, basically, is what it is. And that's just a nice way of saying mob rule is majority rule. So the absence of God as the final authority for moral law paves the way for all sorts of atrocious justifiable acts. Your morality begins and ends where another person's start and stops, absent of a God, right? So, for example, and this question might throw some of you off, but did Hitler do anything wrong when he committed genocide against the Jewish people? So obviously, any normal person would say yes, it was completely horrendous, and it's a stain on history, and that's why we teach it in school, because we don't want to repeat that same mistake. But absent of God existing, how can you argue that what Hitler did was wrong? So when at the time, he and the majority of German society at large felt that it was morally justifiable based on their own morality and perceptions at the time. Now, I've heard some people argue, well, it's wrong because it violates human rights. Okay, valid argument, but who gives us our rights? And if you say government, well, then what happens when government decides you should no longer exist, or you no longer have those rights? Which is exactly what happened in Germany at the time. And to take it a step further, some people might say, well, genocide is wrong because it's objectively wrong. But again, where does that objective point of view come from absent God? So you kind of just keep defaulting back to, well, government, society at large. But at the time, the German government and the German people thought that it was all right to do this. And it was going to benefit the Germans, because Hitler's dream was one nation, one German nation, actually one German world was his goal. It would have helped the German people perfectly. They don't need other cultures. They don't need other people. They just need Germans and Germany's culture. And they would have prospered nicely if he had his way. But luckily, America and the Allies did the right thing and put a stop to the madness. So having that thought in mind, did he do anything wrong? Obviously, yes, he did, but you can't really defend that answer absent God, because the morality behind the action of it being right or wrong was at the mercy of the group, right? Of the powers to be and the majority. Going off of that, you have to ask, well, then, absent God, is any genocide wrong? If you look at it strictly from a naturalistic point of view, of no moral authority and no moral lawgiver, if one group or culture deems itself superior to another and then commits genocide for resources and to expand their own society, culture, power, and strength, then how can you say it's wrong? Again, absent of God. Because if you're looking at it from a naturalistic point of view, and we're all just products of natural macro evolution, animals do this in the wild, so why is it wrong when humans do it? So then I pose the next question: is adults having sex with kids wrong? Any normal person would say yes, but then you would have to again ask, by what moral standard? Because in ancient Rome, right, this was an accepted practice for society at large, and even now in our modern time, there's a push to make this culturally and morally acceptable again. And sadly, it's gaining traction because, again, the opinion of the majority, as it changes, morality will change if there's no foundational moral authority to put a stop to the madness. This is exactly what we're seeing now. If you don't believe me, just Google maps. Not maps as in how to get to a destination, but maps. It's an acronym for minor attracted person. Right now, there's a small push, and it's only going to grow, to classify pedophilia as a sexual preference. There's also, and this has been an organization that's been around for a long time, it's called MAMBLA, right? The Man Boy Love Association. I think I butchered the whole acronym, but groups like this exist where they advocate adult-child relationships. So anyway, moving on. So again, is stealing wrong? If someone has something you want, why not just take it? So these things are, again, as I was saying, these things are wrong because God tells us that they're wrong, not because we're at the mercy of the majority rule or mob rule, what it really is. And again, time has shown us that man's morality is like a house on shifting sand, as the Bible had described, right? Time has shown that we as a society and humans will justify horrendous actions if enough people just decide that it's okay. So this is why, it's important to acknowledge the existence of God and cling to God's moral law, so that way we don't stray, even in the face of a growing group who says otherwise. So then the next point I'd like to share is, you haven't ever heard of it, it's called the intelligent designer theory. So the theory, in short, is life as we know it is so complex that it is more plausible to believe we are the product of an intelligent designer rather than the product of the randomness of nature and random macroevolution. So I just want to put this little side note into. I think where a lot of people kind of have struggles with their faith or with God is because folks think you could either choose between science and religion. I think once we get to, well, I don't want to spoil it for you guys, but you don't have to pick between science and religion. You can have both. And I understand that science contradicts religion sometimes. But as we're going to see, there's a bridge between the two. And for some answers, we just haven't found the bridge yet. The other thing I just want to point out, because some folks forget, science is a tool. Science is a tool of observation for the natural world that already exists. Science observes things, right? It doesn't discover things because everything already exists. It's just waiting to be discovered. So anyway, I digress. So for instance, I'm going to try to I'll describe this chart as best I can for my audio listeners. So the theory of intelligent designer. So there's an intelligent designer. That entity creates the foundations of life and the needs to sustain it, creates humans and creates plants and animals, right? And all these things combine to make life as we know it. Right now, as from the time I made this presentation, the current accepted theory of life's origins is called the Haldane theory. So basically, it goes like this. So some unknown energy source created random amino acids, and they started forming. Those random amino acids turned into random cells, and they started forming. Those random cells eventually turned into random organisms, which started forming, and that ultimately led to life as we know it. So it's very linear, or it is linear. It's a linear progression of life. So the problems with this is, where did this energy source come from to jumpstart life and make the first self-replicating cells? So I'm sure most of you have heard of Richard Dawkins. He's an evolutionary biologist. There was an interview recorded a little while back with Ben Stein, where Ben was talking to Richard, and it was the usual, Ben asks, where does life come from, or who created life, and then Richard would answer, and then Ben would say, well, who created that? Who created, the circular, who created that um, argument. But eventually, when Ben asked who seeded the planet, where did life come from, Richard had to inevitably say that he believed it was possible that aliens seeded the planet, because one of the things they were discussing was this theory. They're in the Haldane theory of life. The story goes that there was this primordial soup millions and billions of years ago, right? It's liquid floating around, or excuse me, it's liquid with a bunch of organisms, or molecules, I should say, floating around, right? And something had to jumpstart that primordial soup to get the process of life started. So the question is, where did that energy come from? And Richard had explained that it's possible that aliens seeded the planet. Aliens are the ones who jump-started that life and started that initial spark of energy to get life started. Another theory has been that lightning struck that pool of water to jumpstart the process, or that a meteorite brought life to Earth. So, based on the Haldane theory, everything came from the same point. Now, the problem with this is there's zero evidence that any organism was once any other organism. So, for instance, a crab never evolved into a fish or a bird. A mouse never evolved into a cat, because life is not linear like that. The other problem is the fossil record shows that there was no life. Then all of a sudden there was an explosion of life in the Cambrian period. So no fossils show any organism becoming a different organism. Life kind of just exploded in the Precambrian era, excuse me. I think ultimately, what most people can agree on, even in like the scientific community, is life had to start somewhere. And one of the arguments is, there's like a super advanced race of aliens, right? Well, then the question becomes again, well, where did that come from? Where did that alien race come from? Where the one prior to that, who made that one, yada, until you're just going in the circular argument. But I've heard some people say, well, the universe is eternal. Well, if the universe is eternal, why can't God be eternal? It just seems, for some people, any answer but God, ultimately. So anyway, so going back to the randomness of all of that happening, the statistical probability of you as an individual existing, right, is 1 in 10 to the 2,685,000 power. The probability of life starting randomly is even lower than that, and it's so low you can hardly put a number on it. I tried to find it and I got a bunch of different answers, but the one that kind of seemed standard across the board was the probability of an individual person existing, which is the number I gave you. But to put that number into perspective, you have a better chance of throwing a nickel randomly into the ocean and having it float into an open soup can that's just randomly sitting at the bottom of the ocean floor. So the problem with randomness is unguided chemical process cannot explain the origin of our complex genetic code because it cannot happen as an unguided process. Ultimately, what is even the reason we exist if thinking about it from a naturalistic view of random creation? If we're just a product of a random creation, what is the point of our existence? So the bottom line is when planets formed and the universe came into existence, how did biological materials just appear randomly? I mean, how did any materials form at all? We realistically, if you think about it, I mean, we should not even exist if it was all random. Not to mention the fact that if you look at humans just from the like a naturalistic perspective, there's no reason for humans to even exist. I really don't even think there's a reason for any mammal to exist past a little single cell organism if life as you know it is all about eating, sleeping, and breeding. There's really no reason for us to exist. There's more to life than living, paying a mortgage, and dying, essentially. you know and I just want to clarify too that some of these things, I understand why it's hard for some folks to wrap their head around because of the way schools teach us and how certain curriculum is beaten into us. But I really encourage folks who are listening and who are watching to really like take time and just dive into these things a little further, because you'll see, and we're gonna get into it a little bit later in this discussion. Science being a tool of observation, sometimes the observer can be wrong. And again, it's a tool of observation and it doesn't work all the time. For instance, like with history, right? Using the scientific method, is it observable? Is it repeatable? By that standard alone, history would not you can't prove history happened. You can't prove history exists, right? Using that method alone. So then moving on to the next point, the axioms of life. As I said before, you don't need to choose between science and faith. You can have both. Science is a tool of observation. Everything already exists, and it's just waiting to be discovered. So because it's a tool of observation and the observer being human, the observations are open to interpretation and are not always infallible. So what I was saying earlier I didn't want to spoil it for you is there's this awesome book called Work of His Hands. It's by a guy named Dr. Cy Gart. Cy Gart, or I should say Dr. Gart, is a former atheist who found God through his research in biochemistry. I really like his book because he has a very awesome way of illustrating that the world around us is the miracle of God, right? And he does it through a scientific lens. And what's even more interesting is he wasn't just an atheist. He was a militant atheist, as he describes himself, right? His whole family, he did not grow up in church. He did not grow up with a religious background. So the fact that he was able to be so disconnected from faith and disconnected from any form of organized religion and found Christ through his work as a biochemist is phenomenal. So, and I just wanted to go ahead also and just read an excerpt from his book. It's a little long, but I think you guys are going to like it. So it describes a story of God saving a believer and a non-believer. So it goes something like this. A man caught in a flood who prays to God to be saved, he hears an answer to his prayer, I will save you, my son. So with a glad heart, he waits for the miracle to happen. A boat comes by, and the people in it call for the stranded man to join them, but he says, no thank you, God will save me. And he continues to wait for the miracle. 2 more boats follow, as in any good folk tale, but his answer is the same. The man drowns. When he gets to heaven, he confronts God. Why didn't you save me like you promised? God says, I sent you 3 boats. What more did you want? Here's another version of the story. Instead of a believer, our hero is an atheist. Caught in the flood, he thinks, it sure looks like only a miracle could save me, but I don't believe in miracles, so I must save myself. He dives into the swirling waters and tries to swim to safety. He sees a boat and hears people calling to him, but as a rational person, he knows that the chances of there being a real boat there just when he needs one are so small as to make such an occurrence essentially impossible. So he decides that the boat must be an illusion conjured up by his mind, and he continues swimming. After he drowns, he also goes to heaven, where God asks him why he didn't get into the boat to save himself. Because it made no sense for there to be a boat there, and I used my reason to reject that possibility. Logic is stronger than belief in fairy tales. The man answers God and smiles. Yet here you are in heaven in front of the real God who made you, as real as the boat that could have saved you. God works through the natural world, and the natural world is the miracle. The meaning of both parables is, of course, that God works through the natural world, and the natural world is the miracle. The first man expected an angel to come down, swoop him up, and carry him to shore. He rejected the possibility that an ordinary boat with a mortal human could be God's instrument of miraculous salvation. The second man assumed that his salvation was entirely in his own hands and rejected even the evidence of his senses that a miracle could happen. Some believers fail to see that the mundane world of nature, with its scientific laws, is itself divine, that is, flowing from God's will and character. They miss the miracle in everything around them, looking instead only to what they consider to be the rigid and undeniable Word of God. They share this blindness with many atheists who, like our second man, also find nature devoid of anything relative to divinity, but they think of all reality as the rigid and undeniable consequence of arbitrary natural law. I think that is such a fantastic way of painting the picture between the natural world and God. And like I said earlier, you don't have to choose between science and faith. You can have both, just like Dr. Garp has both, because he's not afraid to understand that science as a tool of observation is limited. So Dr. Garp explains that there are certain building blocks of life, like cells, atoms, things of that nature, that cannot be divided any further than what they are, and therefore they cannot be self-created or exist unless they were intentionally created. For example, the existence of physical constants like the fixed speed of light, the gravitational constant, elementary charge, things like that. No one knows why the constants are what they are, only that they are set, and the constants just exist, and they all exist perfectly with each other to allow life to go on. So, for instance, like the speed of light is a fixed rate of 299,792,458 meters a second. The Newton's gravitational constant is fixed at 6.67 to the 10 minus 11 power kilogram meter squared. Completely messed that one up. And electron charge is at a fixed rate of 1.602 by 10 to the negative 19 power. And Dr. Garp says in his book as well, which I think is beautifully framed, just as the laws of physics cannot explain or describe the actual event that triggered the Big Bang, the laws of biology cannot explain or understand the origins of life. So moving on to our next point of is there a God? Is where does the source of knowledge come from, right? So where does knowledge and conscious thought come from? Usually the go-to answer for most people is, well, it's just chemicals in our brain. So if it is just chemicals in our brain, how can we have free will, and how are we able to change bad habits or resist urges, right? Like one example I like to use to illustrate this point is an animal won't starve itself aside from it being sick or, some type of injury, right? But like a dog will never fast on its own just to do it. Humans, we do it for sport sometimes. We have the consciousness to make that choice, right? God gave us a rational mind to make rational decisions outside of our physiological urges, right? So, like if a person is hungry, you may choose to fast for whatever your reasons may be, health reasons, religious reasons, whatever. You can make that choice. A dog is never going to not eat for health reasons or religious reasons, obviously, but it's not going to not eat. If it's hungry, a dog is going to eat. Again, unless it's sick, unless there's some other force, an injury keeping it from wanting to eat. We as humans can just choose not to do things, but it's hard. I mean, it's obviously it's easier said than done. And going off of that, we are able to overcome natural urges and desires because we have rational thought and we have intentions with our thoughts and actions, not just because it's random chemicals firing in our brain. Because if it is just chemicals in our brain, you know, why do we have altruism? Why do we have sympathy? Why do we have compassion or any emotions? Some might argue, well, it helps society to get on, keep on keeping on. So if you look at it from a naturalistic point of view, there's really no benefit or evolutionary edge to people being sympathetic or having compassion or emotions to each other. Let's take love, for example. Why do we love? Why are people capable of why are people capable of loving others who may not love them back, right? I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we've experienced that. You love somebody who just doesn't love you back. It is not a benefit for you to feel love. Some might argue, well, it's because, it helps population, right? The breeding. That's kind of a poor example, or excuse me, that's a poor argument, especially in the time and culture we're in now with like, we're in a hookup culture, right? You don't need love to have a kid. People have kids all the time with folks that they don't love. Love is an emotional response that is not beneficial to us. We love because we are made in the image of a loving God, in my opinion. I just don't think it's random chemicals firing in our brain, because the flip side of that coin is, well, if it is just chemicals and somebody's predisposed to certain actions or certain bad behaviors, then how can you blame them for those actions or bad behaviors? I mean, why do we even have laws of people if it's just someone's chemical makeup makes them more predisposed to pedophilia, for example? Those things are wrong, and we know they're wrong. So, but if you're gonna say that it's just a chemical in the person's brain and they have no control over it, that is a slippery slope, which ultimately is where we're going now, like I said earlier, with the whole MAPS movement and trying to normalize sexualizing kids. Not only is it morally wrong because God tells us we're made in the image of our creator. We have rational thought. You can change bad habits or resist urges. And if our thoughts are random chemicals firing, how can we make logical, rational judgments or even trust our own thoughts or observations of the world around us? I mean, you just can't. So, feelings and creation in the human image, as the last point I want to bring up. Evolution doesn't explain why we love, why we create art, why we create music, why we want to laugh, or why we want to think and ponder things. There's no evolution, like I was saying, there's no evolutionary advantage to love. There's no evolutionary advantage to creating art or music or having a good time laughing and having interpersonal connections. Life can go on without those things. It would be miserable and way more difficult, but it would go on. There's no reason for those things to exist from just an evolutionary natural perspective, right? And I just want to clarify too, I don't disbelieve in evolution. Micro evolution, like animals adapting to their environment, is real. I just don't believe in macroevolution where human beings are the products of some linear progression through a common ancestor and bam, here we are. And when you really take the time to read different perspectives on it and see the whole picture, the thought that we come from a monkey or that we come from some random common ancestor that is still undiscovered is actually laughable. Like if you really take some time to think about it, it makes no sense. So we're given a rational mind by an intelligent, rational creator. Without God, we are no better or more valuable than a house cat or a wild dog, which sadly is where society is progressing to just classify humans as nothing more than human shaped animals, being no better or more valuable than a cat, a dog, a bird, which is completely a slippery slope. So the human being is more than just chemicals firing randomly. We have been made in the image of our creator and given dominion over beasts of the earth. So just as a point from scripture, I like to bring up, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them. And that's in Genesis chapter 5, 1 through 2. So on that note, don't ever buy into this naturalistic point of view that humans are nothing but the same, coming from the same, random soup particles from the primordial soup millions and billions of years ago, and thinking that we're not more valuable or created in a more important way than just random animals, cats and dogs, things of that nature. Because that's where society is moving to, and that's very dangerous because of things we've seen. A lot of people I think are kind of giving up hope, and that's why the world is so crazy and the way it is, how it is. Because when people think that they're no better than a cat or a dog or a bird, or when you start to share that sentiment, it's very easy to allow horrendous things to happen to people. Because why would you care if you just look at people as merely random chemicals firing and products of random evolution? Now, one example to just kind of staying on top of the whole science is a tool of observation, and observations can sometimes be wrong. Um, a big argument I hear a lot, obviously, is dinosaur fossils, right? So one thing that I found was interesting, and for my podcast viewers, if you I'll have links to the articles on all my media, so you can check out these articles. They are all from secular scientific institutions, non-Christian, right? So one point with the whole dinosaur fossils maybe aren't as old as they say. When I say they, I mean science. So soft tissue has been found in dinosaur fossils. Now, that's obviously impossible if dinosaur bones are millions and billions of years old, right? Because soft tissue can't fossilize. So a summary of the article I'm going to share is soft tissue has been found in dinosaur fossils, which broke the millions of years narrative. The explanation that scientists came up with is that the iron-rich blood in dinosaurs acted as a type of formaldehyde to preserve it. So to experiment this theory, they used ostrich blood vessels placed in an iron-rich liquid made of red blood cells, which then sat at room temperature for 2 years and didn't decay. So now that's a summary, and I encourage you to read the article. But ultimately, the conclusion was, well, this preservative material that they made was able to keep these blood vessels from decaying for 2 years. And just from that 2 years, they said, we're good, guys. 2 years to 65 million years, we're good. So believing that, some science is as much of a leap of faith as believing in an interdimensional sky daddy. I encourage you guys to read the article. It is very interesting, but I think it's a stretch to assume, given all the different variables of natural fossilization, it's a pretty wild stretch and a huge leap of faith to assume that after doing a little experiment for 2 years with a solution that was man-made and that you assume or believe is close to the original composition of like blood and the amount of iron in dinosaur blood at the time. To say that now we're good for 65 million years and that it's possible, I think is a huge leap of faith personally. And then the other thing I found really interesting, there's often this argument about carbon dating in dinosaur bones using carbon 14, because the weird thing about carbon 14 presence in dinosaur bones is carbon 14 does not last millions and billions of years. I want to say after like 50,000 years, all of carbon has decayed, so it's not detectable in bones. And I know I'm throwing a lot at some of you guys. If you never heard that before, look into carbon dating. And I'm just trying to give you the you know the cliff notes, the highlights, because I don't have time to explain the entire process of carbon dating and half lives and how that works. I encourage you to check it out on your own. It's very interesting. But the cliff note version is this: carbon 14 decays completely after, I want to say, 50,000 years. So what that means is if dinosaur bones are millions and billions of years old, there can't possibly be any carbon detected in the bones. So the summary of the other article that I'm going to share with you guys is carbon 14 found in dinosaur bones means they are tens of thousands of years old, not millions and billions. So the argument from science for the presence of carbon is that there's bacteria in the pores of the bone giving off the carbon. Now, obviously, I'm not a scientist, but that sounds like nonsense to me. So the other thing a lot of folks will default to is radiometric dating. So what radiometric dating is the same thing as carbon 14, but they're just looking for different isotopes, different elements, right? Ones that last longer, that have a higher half-life than carbon. The problem, though, with radiometric dating, and I just found this out recently and was pretty interested, and it was pretty interesting, is with radiometric dating, you can't actually date the bones themselves. Scientists actually date the rock layers around the bones, which actually blew my mind because I was always under the assumption that it was the actual bones being dated. So what they do is they'll radiometric date sediment layers that are older than the bones, then they'll date sediment layers that are younger than the bones, right? For a bracket system. So you'll have your bottom point of oldest rock layer, your topmost point of youngest rock layer, and then the bones are in between there. And then they use some kind of calculation to date the bones. There's a lot of problems with that. That to me just doesn't seem very kosher. So you make of what you will, but if that's news to you and that's piqued your interest, I also have an article link to that so you guys can read it. So that's the end for this conversation. If you guys like what you heard, like I said, I do have a Patreon now. All these PowerPoints are completely free. You do not have to subscribe to the Patreon to get them. Patreon just might have you make an account, but it's free. Feel free to use these if you find them interesting and you just want to share them with your friends, or if you find the conversation interesting and want to deepen your faith more, or just if you're on your walk, if you're not a believer, or again, if it's just interesting to you, feel free to get these PowerPoints to share them. The PowerPoints are just an outline, obviously from all the conversation I just shared with you guys. Use them as an outline, but fill them in on your own. I really encourage you all to look into these things and start kind of unplugging yourself from the reality that's kind of been built around us, because a lot of what you'll start to learn will really, I think, open up your eyes. So other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you at the next one. As always, if you have comments or questions, feel free to drop them in the video comment section below if you're on YouTube, or shoot me an email over at justifiedbelief at gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless you all.